Okay, so I'm from Harvard Business School. I'm not a lawyer, so I should just get that out of the way right now. I'm going to be showing you some data, but this study was done from the perspective of health economists rather than legal scholars. I'm looking forward to a discussion, but there's sort of two things to note about that. The first is that I certainly won't be able to field legal questions, at least with the same skill that many of the other presenters will. And secondly, this paper itself, this project itself is actually already published, so this isn't work in progress, this isn't ongoing. What I will tell you about today is a paper that was published in April of 2018 with this precise name, The Impact of the Entry of Biosimilars, Evidence from Europe. It was published in a special issue of the Review of Industrial Organization that was focused on competition in healthcare markets. I can share that paper with anyone here who would be interested. But you know, what I'll show you is really concluded work. So excited to get feedback and have discussion, but won't be able to change anything about what we've done in this study. Like I said, the date says February 2019 because I updated the slides yesterday, but this is a project that was published last year. So we talked already, and I took out about 5 slides last night, suspecting, it turns out rightly, that other presenters would do a nice job of teeing up why we care about biosimilars. So thank you to Nicholson, to Jordan, to other folks who really set the stage nicely here. Just want to say a few notes about Europe and what we should be thinking about when we think about the European context. So, you know, much like in the US, when we think about biosimilars, these are biologics that have been shown to be therapeutically equivalent to an original medicine and contain essentially the same biological substance. We should be thinking about, you know, many of the same issues, same mechanism of action, used to treat the same disease, development based on comparability to a reference product. We heard that in the United States there wasn't actually even a formal path for biosimilar entry until 2010. And what's interesting about Europe, and the reason we wanted to do this project, is that there has been a pathway for biosimilar entry since 2003. So this is just, there's simply more history to study there. The legal term was introduced in Europe legally in 2003, similar biological medicinal product or biosimilar medicine. These all mean the same thing. You'll often see these used, and what we mean is biosimilar in all of these cases. In the US, we sometimes refer to follow-on biologics. All of these terms refer to biosimilars. And the nice thing about Europe, like I said, because we've had this formal pathway for biosimilar entry since 2003, and because we saw the first set of biosimilars entering as soon as 2006, we've actually got a good deal of data to look back at and see what happened in the early years of biosimilar competition. So what we're going to do in this paper is empirically answer a set of questions. The first is just how variable has entry been across different countries and products. We're going to ask how traditional economic or industrial organization factors like market size predict entry. So, you know, no one here will be surprised to know that the size of a potential drug market is a strong predictor of how many entrants one would expect to see. We're going to ask how that plays out here. We're going to ask what happens to prices in markets with biosimilar entry. This is, you know, why we care. I want to ask also how much take-up do we see? And this is an important note, and this is one that was touched on earlier, but I think is worth revisiting as we think about competition in the United States as well. Because of tendering, biosimilars can lower prices even with 0% take-up. So think about that for a moment. So if I come in as a biosimilar entrant and I say I'm gonna sell my product for 80% below the price of the reference product, and let's now say that Nicholson is selling the reference product, you can just say, hey, I'll just drop my price by 20%. And so my presence in the market can lead to savings for consumers, even if nobody's buying my drug, because it forces the reference product to lower prices. We don't actually think there's a ton of that going on, but it's in theory possible to actually have the presence of biosimilars lower prices, even with 0% biosimilar sales or a very low share of biosimilar sales. And it's like a nuance, but it's quite important as we think about what this all means in the States. And then we're going to ask, in this paper does a good deal of asking what types of buyer institutions and non-procurement policies predict biosimilar entry, price, and take-up. So what I'll be talking about today is actually not focusing on patents or any of the regulatory exclusivity components of this, but rather asking a few questions about other types of institutions that might predict what happens when we get biosimilars. And then, of course, the policy question for the United States is how can buyers best stimulate price competition when biosimilars enter the market? So what are the levers that we might be interested in pulling to actually get more competition? All right, so here's the key, and this is actually what's quite exciting about studying the European Union, is that after EMA approval, there are no regulatory barriers to entry at the country level for any European country. And for all biotech products, you have to go through the European Medicines Agency to get regulatory approval. So what that means effectively is that if you have a biologic drug, the day on which you get European Medicines Agency approval gives you then the opportunity to enter any of the European Union countries, or the countries that follow EMA decisions, which are actually greater than the entire European Union. And so what we can do is we basically have this one specific date in time on which any new biosimilar gets approved and can then enter any number of European markets. We're going to look at the incidence and impact of biosimilar entry across countries. And each country, of course, is going to have a unique institutional environment. We're going to try to catalog that a little bit. We're going to gather what we're going to say is an essentially comprehensive data set of biosimilar introductions, prices, and quantities for the first 3 classes of biologics that had biosimilar entry across 22 European countries plus Australia. Australia is a fun case where basically the Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration decided that if it's good enough for the European Union, it's good enough for us. And as a biosimilar manufacturer, if you have EMA approval, you can just file a few pieces of paperwork and basically start marketing your drug in Australia, so we can throw Australia into the sample if we want, get another country. We're going to combine this with detailed surveys of policies and institutions on the demand side of the market. On the demand side of the market, that just means at the country level, what can we learn about how biosimilar drugs are being procured? Is it happening at the hospital level? Are there tenders? Are there quotas? We're just going to ask these questions, and we're going to do so separately in each of these 3 biosimilar markets, see what we learn. So one European Medicines Agency, there's no option to seek approval at the national level only for small molecule drugs. Some countries allow manufacturers to just seek national approval, not an option here. So everybody has to go through the EMA. We're going to have many different country level markets, which will have some kind of national healthcare scheme, some system for negotiating prices, some way of regulating substitutability, although most countries actually explicitly prohibit pharmacist substitution, and certainly did over the period of time we'll look at. And we'll have different procurement institutions and domestic policies related to education and incentives. Okay, so the good news. The good news is that we have what we think is the first analysis of market entry dynamics, prices, and take-up of biosimilars across a number of different countries. And also the first detailed survey of national health ministries and local experts on procurement and other practices, so I'll be able to tell you how some of these things work. In the European Union, we're going to see, because of this, a lot of variation at the drug class, country, and year level for both prices and quantities. And we're going to be able to look at all procurement and policy variables. And when we did this survey to try to understand procurement policies, we actually asked when those policies came into effect. So, for example, if a quota for a certain type of product was introduced in 2012, we know that, and so we can actually code up that product as having not had a quota in the years through 2011, and then having had a quota in 2012 and beyond, and we'll look at the correlates of that. That's all we're going to, but it will be time varying. However, here's the big caveat. The prices reported, we're going to be using the MIDAS data set from IMS. These are invoice prices. They do not include ex post rebates, which we all know to be a very big deal. Michael can tell us even more about that, but so we're going to have to take the price data with a grain of salt, and we'll run some regressions, but I'm not going to hang my hat on those. All right, so results preview. If folks want to tune out from here, we're going to see significant heterogeneity across countries and drug classes, in particular with respect to entry and penetration. So how many entrants actually show up in a national market, as well as what share of product sold is biosimilar, will vary dramatically across countries, but also within countries and across different product classes. To the extent that we see anything going on, what we see is that what we're going to call effective buyer institutions, so these are things like more committed tenders and quotas, are going to be associated with increased biosimilar entry and penetration. So you will see more distributors entering a market and a higher share of biosimilar sales in those markets where we have these stronger buyer institutions. And the price predictors are going to be a little bit harder to nail down, and we think that probably makes sense because the data are quite noisy anyhow. All right, so this is kind of the Economist's note here, and thank you everybody for teeing up this discussion with some of the earlier presentations. So as we discussed, the fixed cost of entry is going to be higher in these markets. The number of people commented on this due to the complexity and the cost of manufacture, the need for clinical trials, which simply isn't the case in small molecule generic markets. It is also the case that the biosimilar will at present be more differentiated than the generic due to product complexity. This is the bicycle F-15 story. The research capabilities to actually manufacture these things are more sophisticated, so the fixed investment in manufacturing will be higher. It'll require tighter tolerances, more steps, safety precautions, equipment, and tacit knowledge, which we heard a lot about earlier. So from an economics perspective, a basic economic model of what we should see when we have competition in these markets relative to chemical generics would predict that we would get less entry, so we just get fewer competitors entering biosimilar markets, and smaller price drops due to biosimilar entry. As a result, this won't surprise anyone. This is the sort of the tongue-in-cheek thing that my co-author Fiona likes to say. Okay, but do we turn down 20% savings because it's not 90% savings? I think we all agree the answer is probably no, and therefore we should be thoughtful about how we want to incentivize biosimilars in the United States. All right. I'll skip over this. If you're interested in the economics, you can read the paper, but we're gonna do some very simple conceptual modeling. Practically, what we're gonna look at are the three first classes of drugs that had biosimilar competition in Europe. So these are EPO products, which are hormone that controls red blood cell production, filgrastim products, which stimulate the production of white blood cells, and somatropin, which is a human growth hormone product. These are not huge markets. So if you think back to the markets that we saw, I think Jordan had this slide that was the top, what did you have, the top 10 biologic drug markets. None of these products are on that list, but many of those products will be showing up as biosimilars in the future. And then we're going to collect data to the extent we can on a bunch of country-level policies. And there are a bunch of policies that we think should raise the effective market size, and that should induce entry. So these are things like formularies, quotas, and the size and strength of tenders. I'll show you some data on that, but when we talk about tendering, we talk about different types of tenders. So it's like, are you just trying to get onto the product list? Do you have a winner-takes-all tender where the company that offers the best price is given either all of the demand for that, at the level of the tender? So a tender could occur at the hospital level, it could occur at the state level, or it could occur at the country level. And is it a winner-takes-all tender, or is it a winner-takes-all tender but only for new patients? In the early years of biosimilars, as many folks will know, there was a lot of concern about switching patients who were already taking one biologic drug from the reference product to a biosimilar. So a lot of the early tenders in Europe, even the relatively large and relatively strong ones, said these tenders only apply to naive patients, to new patients. We are not going to switch sick kids who are taking growth hormones because of some other very severe disease they have to an unknown product that may or may not have risks that we haven't observed yet. Organizations can be incentivized. So hospitals have a budget and they may keep residual funds. We know this can also be a source of perverse incentives in these markets. So some hospitals, for several years in France, the reimbursement system was such that hospitals got to keep a share of the total amount of euros saved. So a hospital had a very perverse incentive to basically buy a more expensive product and then get a larger rebate relative to buying a cheaper product and getting a smaller rebate. So these incentives can work in both directions. Some of these hospitals also have what we would think of as incentives that are aligned with biosimilar adoption. But hospitals can request procurement bids, they can run auctions. Insurers, in the case of Germany, sickness funds are the equivalent, may develop a formulary. They may have some sort of procurement process that involves bidding, so manufacturers offer different prices, and then the insurer, the sickness fund, takes the best price. The national health system itself may run an auction to either get onto an approved list of drugs in the first place. It may be the case, so in the case of Poland, it's an example, you'll see this in a moment in a graph, but Poland does national procurement for certain types of drugs. And so in the somatropin market, which is the market for human growth hormone products, what we see in 1 year is we see the share of biosimilar product in Poland just jump up to 100% because Poland basically ran a national procurement tendering process and decided the biosimilar was the best deal and that the entire country would just be using biosimilar somatropin from now on, and we indeed see that. And so we heard about this in the survey, and we were at least reassured to see this in the data. In 2012, you basically jump up to 100% biosimilar. And then there's this question that I alluded to earlier, this question of a stock or a flow. And this is one that we'll also have to grapple with in the United States, by the way, as we introduce additional biosimilars, which is this question of, does the biosimilar get introduced only for new patients, or do patients already taking the reference product now start taking a biosimilar? Because that actually has very different implications for the rate of take-up, right? So that's just a question we'll have to think about. Then there are a bunch of other methods to encourage the utilization of biosimilars. Physicians may have financial or non-financial incentives. An example of a non-financial incentive is that in some countries, Austria and Germany, for example, physicians, if they do not use a biosimilar when a biosimilar is available, they have to do extra paperwork. And that's a pain in the... So if you're a physician, that is a huge disincentive for... You don't want to do the extra 3 pages of paperwork to justify using the reference product if you could just use the biosimilar and not do the extra paperwork. So this is what we mean when we talk about non-financial incentives. Some physicians also have drug budgets, and whether or not those biologic drugs are part of their drug budget will impact the choices that doctors make. There are a number of education programs. You'll see these, about a third of countries have some form of physician education. This is like literature aimed at physicians, professional meetings, professional association guidelines, information about price savings. And then some countries actually run local scientific evaluations. So in the UK, NICE specifically does studies to look at not the efficacy, but the effectiveness of biosimilars in the UK NHS context. And the idea is that would be more compelling. If you're a British doctor, you're more compelled by evidence from your own healthcare system on the use of biosimilars than just some random study that was submitted to the European Medicines Agency. And then, of course, quotas. And these quotas can happen at a bunch of different levels. In Germany, for example, quotas happen at the state level. So the state of Bavaria has different quotas for biosimilars than the state of Berlin. And so we see these interesting even within country variations. And that I won't be able to tell you about today, but we will just look at were there or were there not quotas. All right, so the first EMA biosimilar approval happened in 2006. A series of those happened shortly thereafter. This data set will capture the first 15 products approved for marketing in the European Union. For future work, this is something I think is interesting, and I hope somebody kind of takes a deep dive here. There are actually fewer of what we're going to call development programs. So if you actually look at who is doing the manufacturing of these products, it's far fewer than this number 15. So probably like half a dozen different manufacturing programs that are responsible for making all of these drugs. I just think that's interesting, and we weren't able to take a deep dive there. We will have data from the years 2007 to 2014 inclusive, so that will be 8 calendar years of data. And then we'll have these 3 markets that I told you about. We'll have 22 European countries plus Australia. And then 2 of the countries, Lithuania and Sweden, drop out of the data after 2012, so it's not quite a balanced panel, but you get the gist of it. These are the 15 products that we're able to look at. Again, we're going to go through the end of 2014. There were a couple of products in 2013 and 2014 that were granted European Medicines Agency approval. Those are the ones in gray. We won't be able to look at those because even though biosimilars were approved by the European Medicines Agency before the end of our data set, the patents were such that most of these products actually couldn't enter most countries until 2015. So we won't be able to see much there. All right, so what happened? So here are some pictures. This looks like kind of rainbow spaghetti. These are total biosimilar sales in European markets. And these are reported as shares. So what each of these lines tells you is what share of total sales in each of these markets was sales of biosimilar product in each year. And remember I told you that anecdote about Poland, how Poland decided that for somatropin products, they were just gonna only buy biosimilars. That's this yellow line right here. So in 2012, it just jumps up to 1 and stays at 1. Yes?
Can I ask what's that weird jagged thing?
Yeah, so there's some weird jagged things. And we tried, so part of the rest of the analysis we did was being dissatisfied with like making 3 graphs of rainbow spaghetti, because what one would hope is that there would be some sort of adoption curve and that things would like monotonically be going kind of up and to the right over time, and in fact that's not what we see. So that could be a number of things. This could be actually just, for instance, that is EPO. So that could be, and what country is that? Oh boy, Denmark. So that might be that, I know, well, put Tim on the spot. But a lot of these tenders are happening every year or every other year. So it could simply be the case that after the introduction of biosimilar EPO, that the reference product manufacturer said, actually, you know what, you guys will lower our price if you come back. And so that is why you, like, that's the mechanical explanation for why you might see that. We don't know what actually happened in Denmark in 2011, but that's what, you know.
I can check it out.
You can check it out. Thank you. Good. Follow-up item. This is, I told a couple of people earlier today, if I could only show you one picture from this paper, it would be this picture. And this is what I think is compelling. So this is our last, so this is the total, the biosimilar share of total unit sales, so just what share between 0 and 1 of total sales in each of these markets was biosimilar product in the last year for which we have data. For most countries, it's 2014. Like I said, for 2 countries, for Sweden and Lithuania, the data end in 2012. Actually, I even took them out of this picture. What's fascinating about this is that we see this within country variation. So it's not the case. I think when we think about other things, other types of procurement in healthcare, we think that some countries are just bad at buying drugs or just have bad institutions. We just think that like Italy and Spain are not as vigilant about drug procurement and not as thoughtful about it as like Germany. And this tells us that it's actually something much more complex and nuanced than that, that there's something specific about like even just look at Poland. So Poland has 10% penetration of biosimilar filgrastim, but is using only biosimilar somatropin and then also a high share of biosimilar EPO. So something about how these drugs are procured even within country must be going on, because otherwise, if some countries were just really committed to biosimilars in a very universal way, then all of these bars would be lined up within country, and that's not the case. So I think that's also why we wanted to try to take a deeper dive into some of these procurement institutions. Okay. So we're going to collect data on the average number of distributors per country, the average relative price. Again, this is the piece you should take with a grain of salt. We tried to be thoughtful about prices. I think there are 2 interesting ways to think about prices. The first is taking the current biosimilar price and comparing that to how much the reference product cost in the year before biosimilar competition. The other version of that is saying, what's the, then we do like, we take the 90th percent distribution of that because there's probably some weird outliers. The other way to think about that is to look at the, did I label this right? The average relative price of, so what is the average current prevailing price in that product market relative to what it used to be? So once we average, so basically saying, you know, if it's the case that biosimilars caused reference products to lower their prices now, then we should take the prevailing price in EPO markets and compare that to what the prevailing price in EPO markets was before there was any competition. Again, I'm not totally convinced these data are clean. And then we look at the average fraction of biosimilar sales. The thing that I'll just point out is that this varies quite a bit across these 3 markets. So in EPO, we get nearly 30% of all sales are going to be biosimilar on average after there was biosimilar competition, whereas with somatropin, it's under 10%. So, you know, meaningful differences. We're going to look at indicators of market size. These are pretty crude. These are things like GDP per capita, average pharmaceutical expenditure in that country as a share of GDP, national pharma expenditure in billions of dollars. This is, I don't want to go into the details of how we did this, but we're going to basically, we went out and found people who understood procurement in each of these countries and had them fill out a small survey for us. So you don't need to see how the sausage is made, but we are going to collect data on what happens with procurement. So if there was tendering, we're going to say how big were those tenders? Did those tenders happen at the hospital level, at the state level, at the national level? So, you know, what was the average size of the tender population? You know, on average, each of these tenders that were happening in European countries applied to something like 1 million to 3 million individuals. We're going to look at the average size of the tender population as a share of the total. how many country years had any sort of tendering. I think this is actually really interesting. So most European countries are doing tendering. So over 90% of drug procurement happening in EPO and filgrastim markets is happening through some form of tender. So that tells us, at least in Europe, that like getting the tendering right seems to be important because everybody's doing it anyhow. In somatropin, it's over 80%. And then I mentioned these different strengths of tenders. So the question is like, is it, does the winner get all new patients? Does the winner of the tender get all demand? And the sort of very, very binding tenders where the winner of the tender gets all patients, both new and existing, that's a lower share. So that's something like 53 to 59% of countries are doing that. And then we're going to do some interaction terms. Okay. And then we've got lastly, these other incentives and policies. So we're going to look at things like non-financial physician pressure to use biosimilars. That's actually pretty pervasive. So nearly half of countries have some way of incentivizing physicians that's non-financial to encourage doctors to use biosimilars. Physician financial incentives also exist, but they're slightly less common. Many countries, nearly 30%, have some form of physician education programs at the national level about the use of biosimilars. That's something we don't yet meaningfully have in the United States, so something we could talk about. We're going to look at public or patient education, domestic biosimilar effectiveness studies, as are done in the UK. Are there any places with quotas? Quotas are not that common, but what we'll see in some of the models is that where they do exist, they seem to predict the use of biosimilars. That is probably just a mechanical thing, because if by law you have to use biosimilars, use more biosimilars. And then just we're going to sum a lot of these up for some of our regression analyses. So the average number of non-procurement incentives to use biosimilars is some number that's a little greater than 1. So each of these countries has roughly 1.5 other things going on beyond procurement. All right, so these results are, these tables are actually terrible to see on these slides. I apologize. I'll highlight a few things. The first is if you look across the top row of this table, this is just regression analysis. What you see is that on average, and we're going to predict the number of unique distributors in each country's market. So just looking at, do you have 1 additional biosimilar distributor, 2, 3, 4? Over time, you get, basically every 5 years, you get an additional distributor on average. So part of this is just, it's kind of a slow ramp up, but on average over time, we're just getting more distributors enter naturally. We see more entry in EPO and filgrastim markets than somatropin markets. These are larger markets, so that's not totally surprising. From the folks I've talked to suggest that EPO is also particularly, it's not easy, but among these products, it's relatively easy to get into if you want to. We also see that things like GDP or national pharmaceutical expenditures are strongly predictive of entrance. This coefficient, if you take it to its logical conclusion, tells you that every 1 to 1.5 additional billion dollars in national GDP you have at the country level will buy you another entrant. So every time your GDP goes, countries' GDPs don't actually increase by $1 billion, but as you move from, a country like Portugal to a country like France, you would expect to have more competition. We see that quotas also lead to more entry, and again, that's this mechanical effect of that happening. And stronger tenders also predict more entry. So the more binding the tender is, and that's particularly true in EPO markets, the larger the number of entrants you would expect to see in those markets. We're gonna we look at prices again. I told you I didn't want to hang my hat on these results. But on average, just that top row of this table tells you that prices are declining by a couple of percentage points per year on average. That effect seems to be strongest in the EPO and the filgrastim markets, where those numbers are actually more like 6, 7, 8% percentage point declines per year. Again, here we see that we have some evidence that what was I going to say? That we see lower prices in slightly larger markets, but again, not a lot of statistical significance here. All right, this is the last set of results I'm going to show you. If we look at the biosimilar share of total sales, so these are the results that mirror those graphs I showed you with the spaghetti. What we see again is that in the top row over time, the biosimilar share of total sales is increasing by something like 5 percentage points per year on average. So again, this is just this sense in which over time you get more adoption. These are bigger effects in EPO and filgrastim than somatropin, which again, these are the two larger markets. And again, here the stronger tenders, so this is this row here, the stronger tenders are associated with a larger share of biosimilar sales. So if you have a tender that applies to all patients or applies to a greater swath of your population, you're going to also have a greater share of biosimilar sales overall. All right, so I'll conclude and then hopefully we can discuss for a few minutes. We looked at entry into 3 key large markets with significant heterogeneity across biosimilars and countries in market share and relative price. We see that more committed buyer institutions, things like tenders and quotas, tend to be associated with increased biosimilar entry and penetration. And that the predictors of price appear to be more drug or class specific, and they're difficult to understand based on these data. We think that competition for biologics without patent protection will be an important tool for controlling future healthcare costs in both the European Union and the United States. I think that goes without saying if we're in this room. The regulatory regime determining entry cost is critical. So our hope with this economic study was that the calibration of a single model would help us understand the effect of things like entry regulations on market structure. Biosimilars in Europe have had varied successes, especially in these early years of biosimilar competition. We've shown some outcomes, and we think that things like buying institutions and public policies around and in addition to patents and regulation are likely to be meaningful in understanding what actually happens with biosimilar take-up. Moving forward, we hope that the policy lessons will be useful for the United States. And that's my email address if you have any questions.
So I wanted to ask where you concluded lessons for the U.S. I mean, this is all fascinating.
Yeah.
And there's so many differences with the U.S.
So many differences, yeah.
Buyers, the regulations, but still you found out so much that's interesting. What do you think we can extrapolate?
Yeah, so I think one thing we definitely have going for us in the United States is that we're just a huge market. And the one consistent thing across the regression models that we ran is that the greater the number of patients, the greater the size of pharmaceutical spend, the greater the GDP, the more biosimilar entry you get. It's just a more interesting market. So that's, I think, a useful thing. It's an interesting jumping off point. I think also understanding, the decisions that we make about topics that we chatted about earlier about, substitution interchangeability are going to be extraordinarily important for understanding what actually happens. We talked a little bit earlier, I don't remember whom I was chatting with in the lunch break about physician education, but we do have at least some evidence to suggest that that the take-up of biosimilars is higher in settings where there are more non-financial incentives for doctors to actually use them. And so, is there something meaningful that we could do either at the state level or through regulation to actually create information about biosimilars, about safety profile? There's a lot of concern early on that has not been borne out that, for example, patient switching would be very dangerous. And so a lot of the reasons, I mentioned this briefly, that countries adopted these tendering policies where the tender only applied to new patients was out of concern that we might have some sort of unforeseen negative consequences of switching folks from a reference product to a biosimilar. All of the switching studies that have been done have not found any adverse effects above and beyond what would otherwise be expected with the reference product from switching patients. And so I think what we now know a decade out is that we can be reasonably confident, at least for this set of biosimilars, that switching is not a big issue. So I think incorporating these little pieces of learnings from Europe into how we design policies in the US will be useful. But I agree entirely, we have really different healthcare institutions in so many ways. Yeah.
So 2 questions. One is, are there particular things that you found surprising that you didn't expect to find? And the other is, what are we doing wrongest? Mm-hmm. I'm sure we're doing lots of things that are wrong, but
yeah.
Where should we start punching?
Oh boy. I mean, I think going back to Mike's presentation, I think just what's, and some of that, your talk, right? Like what's preventing like actual meaningful biosimilar entry. Like we've approved in the United States many more biosimilars than are actually out there selling product. And so like what's missing there, I think is a question worth answering. I don't know that we can learn the answer to that question through Europe. I think the thing that I learned while doing this study that actually just begs more research is even within countries, there are really remarkable stories. So I mentioned this fact. I happen to have a bunch of academic connections in Germany. So I didn't realize there's 16 states in Germany. Each state has its own biosimilar quotas. And so because Germany has this very federalized health insurance system where there are sickness funds that operate at the state level, and there's an umbrella organization that does drug procurement, but each state basically regulates its own health insurance. In Germany, there are literally states that have double the biosimilar quota of other states within Germany. Timo's nodding, so I know that. So states in the former West Germany that tend to be richer and more fiscally responsible have much higher biosimilar quotas than other states. Like that's just a fact. And so I think, there's so many levels at which if somebody really wanted to roll up their sleeves and dig into the data, you could learn interesting things. But even within a country like Germany, that has, in a bunch of ways been very forward-thinking about having physician education and having actual policies around biosimilars, you still see these big regional within-country variations. That surprised me. That's not so much something we learned in the paper, it's something we learned while writing the paper. Yes?
So I want to just talk a little bit about the data you found about the price drop with the entry of the biosimilar. So one of the concerns that we talked about earlier was that upon entry, the biologic or the innovator might raise its price to kind of offset the decrease that would come through competition.
Yes.
And the biosimilar would similarly raise its price because everybody likes a bigger profit.
Yes.
And so, did your data show that? Did that play out in that?
Yeah, so we didn't, what would have been the smoking gun there is actually to look at what was going on with prices in the years leading up to when biosimilars showed up. We didn't quite have enough lead time because our data set starts in 2007 and the first set of biosimilars were approved in 2006.
Right.
And then the entry was in 2006 for EPO, 2007 for... No, 2006 for somatropin, 2007 for EPO, and 2008 for filgrastim. So we saw in rapid success. We just don't have a lot of pre-period data. I think something that would be really interesting to see and would be more of a smoking gun for this type of behavior would be actually to look at what was going on with reference product prices in the years leading up to biosimilar approval. And we could do that now in many different markets because now we have twice as many different product classes of biosimilars that have been approved by the European Medicines Agency. So we could say for infliximab products, like what was going on in the 2 years leading, because this is something that's been alleged to be a behavior that happens. The tricky thing with this data set, and this is, I just brought this slide up so you can see like the data are a little problematic, is because we don't have the rebate data, we don't actually know what's going on here. So some of these numbers, like if you look at them, I brought this slide up so that I can show you why I'm very suspicious of this price data. So for example, if we look at the average relative price, so we look at the current price of the biosimilar relative to the reference price of the product in the year before biosimilar entry, this number is actually way above 1. So that says that tells you, like interpreting that number says that the price of the biosimilar on average after biosimilars entered the market was 50% higher than the price of the reference product before biosimilar. But like what's probably happening is something much more complex with rebates. I think if you talk to Europeans about what's actually going on, we're looking at numbers in kind of the low double digits in savings, like biosimilars are being sold for something like 85%, 80% of the reference product price. That's like, this number is not indicative of that. And so that's why we actually took the 90th percentile of that relative price, and you still get a number that's greater than 1, which would suggest no savings. And that's why we're suspicious of the price data. But yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to exercise the reverse moderator's privilege by asking the last question.
Okay, great. Yeah, we're...
And so I have a question that's just I guess a basic descriptive question about the data that you have. With respect to GDP size of a country and biosimilar entry, I think one of the conclusions that you had earlier was that essentially the larger the GDP, the more likely we are to see entry. But in taking a look at some of the,
Yeah.
I think it was like slide 23. No, it was a little,
Around here?
a little bit prior to that. But anyway, it was the slide that was listing all of the countries and the entry percentage. And I'm starting to get the sense, especially seeing the United Kingdom's just like utterly abysmal Biosimilar entry record, that maybe it actually is more of like a U-shaped curve, right? Rather than necessarily just kind of capping out at the top. And that with respect to the market in the United States, that would be really helpful to know for some kind of comparative.
I see. So if we're like on the wrong side of the inverted U, then we're in,
right? I mean, because at some, and it has some intuitive purchase because at some sense you get so rich you're indifferent to the marginal dollar, right? But I just didn't know if that's what you saw or not. So,
we didn't see anything like that. Like if anything, on average, the bigger the market, the more entry you get, and that's after you control for things like what's going on with tenders. So once we control for like the unit of tendering, so once we control for the fact that the average tender is going to apply to 2 million individuals, just how big your country market is above and beyond that has additional predictive power. So what that would tell us is 2 countries that both have the same, that where if you win a tender, you get 2 million patients, whether you're in the UK or Norway, you still get more entry in the UK.
Right.
So, but we don't see any evidence of that. I think I'm pretty sympathetic to the question of just like, what do we learn here? Because the United States is so different. I think the one thing I take comfort in is we overall do see more individual entrants showing up in larger countries, in larger markets. And so that would suggest that there's at least a big enough piece of pie at stake with the United States that there's an interest in doing this if the institutions allow for it. So, all right, I'll stop.
All right, thank you.